This is a lecture for History 122, World Civilizations from 1600, Section 5, the Americas and New Science. The objectives for this section are to examine how the political, economic, scientific, and industrial revolutions impacted the New World, and this would include both North and South America. We will also try and understand why British North America was relatively more stable and prosperous than Latin America, even though both are going to be, in a sense, blessed with abundant natural resources. We will also trace the rise of the American Empire. We will examine the development of new science, right? We've talked about the scientific revolution in section 3. We're going to talk about how the science will continue to develop and become more complex, and that will make people increasingly optimistic and, in some cases, pessimistic at the same time. We'll also try and examine the rise of so-called scientific understandings of race as central to identity. We will start this section with Latin and South America, and I need to say a little bit about these terms. Latin America generally is understood to mean the Spanish-speaking countries of the Americas, and this could, of course, would include places like Mexico, Venezuela, Honduras, Argentina. Sometimes, though, that's understood not to include Brazil because that is primarily a Portuguese-speaking country. And at the same time, we also use this term South America. But the problem with South America, of course, is that it kind of excludes Mexico, because that's in North America, as well as countries like Honduras and Nicaragua and Costa Rica, because they are also part of North America. So it gets a little complex, that we don't really have a good term that includes all these regions, which is a problem because, of course, they were settled by the Spanish and the Portuguese, who have certain cultural characteristics. There's a lot of similarities in how these countries developed. But I just want to highlight that kind of issue with terminology. So I will sometimes use those terms kind of interchangeably, but basically I'm talking about the part of the Americas from Mexico and then on down south, right? So when I'm talking about Latin South America, that's what I mean. It's not technically correct because, like I said, Mexico's part and Honduras are part of North America, but just so we're understood, that's the region that I'm kind of focusing on here in this part of this section. Now, in this section, there's some Spanish words that we need to learn, and I apologize, I do not speak Spanish, so I'm probably going to mess up the pronunciation, but I think I can get close enough for practical purposes. But it's very important to understand what these terms mean, because we'll be using them throughout this part of the section, right? So you want to know what these terms mean. You will be expected on the quizzes, the exams, whatever, to be able to know what they mean. So I want to stress that's very important. So one reason we want to know that is because the way that people from the United States and the way that people in Latin and South America have thought about race is often very different, right? They often thought about race very differently. So, for example, in the United States, there was tendency not to intermarry between races. That was considered problematic. That was considered bad. Of course, when there was segregation, where would you put people who were mixed race, right? But in Latin America and South America, it was quite common to have mixed race people, right? That was considered normal in a sense and acceptable. So it was a little bit different, right? And so they developed their own kind of vocabulary. And what's confusing is sometimes their vocabulary, the way they use a certain word like Creole, is different from the way people in the United States have used that word. So it can be very confusing. So it's important to understand these terms and what I mean by them in this section. Now, though, before we talk about those terms specifically, we have to understand that Latin America, South America, Brazil were conquered by the Spanish and by the Portuguese. The Portuguese, of course, conquered Brazil. So most of this territory is going to follow under Spanish rule, and a good part of this territory, Brazil, is going to fall under Portuguese rule. And what's really important about that is that means that the Europeans come in, the Spanish Portuguese come in, and they've conquered these areas. That means they're in charge, right? That means they're in charge. I mean, it was very simple. They just come in, they take over. So that gives them a lot of power in these societies. And the key thing is that the closer you are, in a sense, to those conquerors from Spain and Portugal, generally speaking, the more power you have in society, right? The closer you are to those Spanish and Portuguese conquerors, the more power you have in Latin American, South American, Brazilian society. So let's now look at these terms. So the first term that we use is Creole. Creoles were full-blooded Europeans of Spanish or Portuguese descent born in the colonies, right? So if you're, let's say your father and mother both are born in Portugal, they immigrate to Brazil, and you are born in Brazil, you are a Creole. Your mother and father are from Spain. They immigrate to Venezuela. You are born in Venezuela, you are a Creole. You will have lots of land and power, most likely, right? So this is someone, like I said, a full-blooded European. All of their ancestors that they know of are Europeans, but they're born in the colonies. They are a Creole. They have lots of land and power. People like me, whose ancestors are all from Europe, but I'm born in the United States, I would have been considered a Creole, basically. Now, these people are near the top, but they're not actually on top. They are going to face discrimination from native-born Spaniards or Portuguese called peninsulares, who will be in control of the government. Remember a while back when we looked at that theory of mercantilism, and I showed you that comic of the servants bringing the woman food, right? And she was the mother country, and they were labeled as the colonies, and they were bringing also not just food, but raw materials and things like that. Remember, it was understood that the colonies exist for the sake of the mother country, right? The colonies exist for the sake of the mother country. So what happened was typically Spain and Portugal used people that were born in Spain and Portugal, officials from there, to govern these colonies. So the highest offices, like the governorship or the viceroyalty or whatever they called it in the time period, there's different terms at different times in different places, but the highest officials who governed the colonies were peninsulares. They were people who were born in Spain or born in Portugal, and they controlled the government. They're called peninsulares. It sounds like peninsula because they were born on the Iberian Peninsula. They were born either in Portugal or in Spain. Right, so those people are in charge. Typically, they're the highest of the high, and the Creoles do not like them because they're like, why are these peninsulares in charge of Venezuela? I'm a Venezuelan. I was born here, and I'm just as European as they are. I'm just as white as they are. Why are they in charge of Venezuela when I am their equal and I'm a Venezuelan? Right, so you can see this kind of frustration that the Creoles will experience, right? They say, we're just as good as you, peninsulares. We're just as, and by just as good as you, they mean we're just as white as you, essentially. We're just as European as you. We just happen to be born here. And since we were born here in, say, Venezuela, we should be the ones governing Venezuela. And that's key to understand why these Creoles are going to eventually want independence. Now, one thing that happened in Latin America and these other areas that we're talking about, there oftentimes were not all that many European women. There weren't a whole lot of Spanish or Portuguese women. So a lot of the men, in particular, a lot of Spanish and Portuguese men who immigrated would marry native women. They would marry the descendants, or they would marry the indigenous people. And if you look at this picture that I've included here, that's an example of such a marriage, right? On the left is a European man, and in the middle is a native woman, and then on the right is their child. Their child will be called a mestizo, right? Their child will be called a mestizo. Mestizos are people of mixed parentage. They're the children typically of European and native peoples, right? I'm always kind of interested in mestizo culture because my wife is from the Philippines. That's a culture that was influenced a lot by Spain because it was a Spanish colony before it became an American colony, before it became independent. And so our children in the Philippines are called mestizos, right? They're biracial, and they would be considered mestizos. So mestizos are the children of European and native peoples. They have some land and maybe a little bit of power, but not nearly as much as the Creoles, and certainly not as much as the peninsulares. So you can see, like I said, that there's this kind of connection. The closer you are to Spain and Portugal, the more powerful you are, right? The most powerful people are the people who actually came from there, followed by the people who were their descendants, followed by the people who are partly their descendants. And on the bottom are the native peoples and the people of African descent. Remember that a large number of people from Africa are going to be brought as slaves into Latin America, especially into Brazil. And these people often have little or no land or power. They're oftentimes at the margins. And of course, the poor people that are being brought from Africa, not only do they not own property, typically they are considered property. So it's very important, like I said, to understand that we have this kind of racial hierarchy in Latin America and Brazil that's connected to how close you are to those Europeans in Spain and Portugal. And it's also related to your economic and social power in society. In a sense, the closer you are to Europe, the more powerful you are in this society. Now, in terms of struggling for independence, it's the Creoles who are most interested in independence, right? It's the Creoles who are most interested in independence and most able to work for independence. Remember, the Creoles have some power. They have land, right? There's not actually that many peninsulares, though there's some. The Creoles tend to be the leaders in this society, right? They're the ones that have a lot of land. They're the ones that have a lot of power. And they're also the ones that are frustrated. Other people are frustrated. Of course, slaves in particular are frustrated because they're slaves, and being a slave is terrible. You do not want to be a slave. But the slaves can't do much about their frustration, right? They're kind of weak in society. The Creoles, though, are frustrated, and they have the wealth, the power, and the education that they can use to try and deal with their frustrations. So, and remember, the Creoles are frustrated in particular because they feel discriminated against by the Peninsulares. The Creoles say, why is it you Peninsulares get to be in charge? We're just as white as you. We're just as European as you, even though we were born here. And in fact, because we were born here in Latin America, who better than to govern it? And to give you an example of one thing that they're frustrated about, one reason why they want more self-government is they don't like mercantilism. Just like the North Americans, just like people from what would become the United States, they did not like having to follow economic policies that primarily benefited either Spain or Portugal. Remember, we talked about in a previous section how Americans, right, people from the colonies that would become the United States, how they did not like having to sell their products to Britain when they could sell it to someone else at a higher price, right? Again, remember that image. If you're the colony, you're the servant having to serve the mother country. Creoles do not like having to follow the economic policies of Spain or of Portugal. They want to be able to sell their goods to whoever will pay the highest price. Argentina ranchers who raise very good cattle and from it make high quality beef want to be able to sell that beef at the highest price. And remember, during this time period, the British really wanted that beef and were willing to pay higher prices than Spain was willing to pay, right? But it is illegal for the Creoles to sell their beef directly to the British at the price they want. So the Creoles in Latin America, they want to be in charge. They want to run Venezuela. They want to run Argentina. They want to be in charge. And an example of why they want to be in charge is because they would like to have free trade, because then they can get more money for the things they're selling, because they can sell them to whoever they want. They don't have to sell them to the Spanish in particular. And they're inspired in a large part by Enlightenment ideas. Many of them are liberals. Remember, we talked about liberalism. Many like the idea of liberalism. So not only do they want to establish a government in which the Creoles, are in charge, they want that to be a liberal government. And one thing that will happen, and these revolutions are going to happen after the American and French revolutions in general, and will at times kind of overlap a bit with the Haitian Revolution. We'll talk more about the Haitian Revolution later. That shows that it can be done, right? So people in Latin America, they know that the 13 colonies in what will become the United States successfully obtained their independence. And so Latin Americans say, well, hey, we can do this too, right? If the Americans did it, right? The people up north, if those North Americans in a sense did it, the 13 colonies, then we can do it too. Similarly, the French Revolution will also be inspiring. Oh, these French people overthrew their king. We certainly can do that too. And remember, we talked about how the French Revolution will eventually lead to a coup in which Napoleon will take over. And when Napoleon takes over, he goes out and conquers a bunch of countries. And Napoleon conquers Spain and Portugal. And if you want to launch a rebellion, launching a rebellion when the country that controls you theoretically is been conquered by another group sounds like a good idea, right? If you want to rebel against Spain, rebelling against Spain when it's been conquered by France is probably a good idea, because the Spanish are going to be worried about getting rid of France, not trying to keep control over you. Right? So we're going to see, especially in the early 19th century, these frustrations, these Enlightenment ideas, this desire for self-government, this rejection of mercantilism, the example of the American-French revolutions, and the conquest of Spain and Portugal are all going to kind of combine and make it possible for increasing numbers of South American, Latin American countries to obtain their independence. Now, what's kind of difficult, of course, is that there are a lot of different countries in Latin America, South America. I mean, wow, we've got Honduras, we've got Nicaragua, we've got Costa Rica, we've got Venezuela, we've got Argentina, we've got Mexico. There's a bunch. And we can't, of course, look at every single one. So I'm going to just give you some examples to give you kind of an understanding of the diversity that you could have in these revolutions, right? So one thing that I hope we can get out of this is, even though these countries that we're talking about are similar in some ways, and that they had similar kind of understandings of race, they had, of course, the Spanish and Portuguese influence, they are also going to kind of go on their own paths in history, so that we can understand that they are, of course, different. And I'm going to do my best then to show you that kind of diversity. So we're first going to start looking at Brazil's war for independence. Right? So what happens is, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon will conquer Portugal, and the royal family will flee to Brazil. Remember, and what's interesting about this, of course, is Brazil is actually a much larger and wealthier country than Portugal itself was. So what's funny is that even after Napoleon was defeated, the king of Portugal didn't want to leave Brazil. He was kind of happy being there, but eventually the people of Portugal were like, Napoleon's gone now, we need you to come back and rule us, King of Portugal. So the King of Portugal does finally return from Brazil to Portugal, but not his son, Prince Pedro, right? Not his son, Prince Pedro. And eventually, what will happen is that there will be a revolution, a conservative revolution centered around the prince, that will bring independence, right? So in 1821, an independence movement will be launched by Brazil, focusing on this descendant, right, Prince Pedro, this descendant of the King of Portugal. And this is going to be a largely peaceful war for independence. You may say, well, how's it peaceful when it lasts from 1821 to 1824? Well, I say that because we'll see it is comparatively peaceful to places like the revolutions in Mexico and Central America. It will only kill a few thousand people, and Portugal is not going to fight that hard to keep control over Brazil, because it knows that in the end, Brazil is bigger and wealthier and across the ocean, so there's no way they can really hold on to it. So this revolution will proceed relatively peacefully. It will be similar to the American Revolution that we studied, in that it's not going to bring a lot of changes in terms of society, in terms of the economics. The people who benefit from this are the Creoles. They're the ones who will now have their own government that they can kind of operate on and run. The Peninsulares cannot boss them around anymore, but the people on the bottom do not. Right? The mestizos are still going to stay relatively poor. The people of African descent are still going to remain slaves. So they do gain independence, right? They do gain independence, but there's not going to be a social revolution. This is going to look a lot like the American Revolution as opposed to the French Revolution. And you can see how conservative it is in that they're the last country in South America to abolish slavery. They actually do not get rid of slavery until the 1880s. Right? So this was a war for independence, a war in a sense for liberation from Portugal, but it's not a war of liberty really for anyone except the Creoles. Right? This is a war that will primarily benefit the Creoles. Now, in contrast, the Mexican War for Independence is going to be a lot more bloody, a lot more complex, and lasts a lot longer. And we're going to talk about Mexico in a couple different sections in this class. I think Mexican history is very fascinating. It's something that Americans typically don't know much about, which is unfortunate since Mexico is an important neighbor of ours. So it is important to kind of talk about this, and it's important to appreciate the complexity of it. And what's particularly important is notice I refer to this as the Mexican War for Independence. The Mexican Revolution is actually something that's going to happen a lot later in the early 20th century. So it makes things a little bit more complex because, the American Revolution is a war for independence, but the Mexican War for Independence is differentiated from the Mexican Revolution, which is something we'll talk about later. But right now, we're focusing on how Mexico becomes independent. So like I said, it's a very complex situation. But there's something kind of similar with what happens with Brazil, right? Because a lot of it is connected to the fact that Napoleon is going to conquer Spain, right? Napoleon is actually going to conquer Spain. And what is going to happen is some Creoles in Mexico say, oh, this is our opportunity to become independent, because of course Spain is busy, being conquered. They can't worry too much about us. So they will try and overthrow the Spanish viceroy, that is essentially the governor of Mexico, the Spanish Peninsulare, who's in charge of Mexico, whose loyalty is primarily to Spain. They will try and overthrow him in 1808, but will fail. Right? So you've got Creoles trying to overthrow a Peninsulare, the viceroy of Mexico, so that they can become independent. That fails. However, a couple years later, a man that we refer to as Padre Hidalgo. Now, if you speak Spanish, or even if you don't, you may know that Padre means father. It's not his first name. Padre Hidalgo refers to a Catholic priest whose family name was Hidalgo. He will lead a rebellion in 1810, but the purpose of the rebellion isn't so much about getting independence. It's helping the mestizos, who are the majority of the population, but who lack land. One thing that we need to stress is that, remember I talked about how Creoles control lots of land. They're a minority. The majority population in places like Mexico are the mestizos, and they control very little land. And remember, during this time period, wealth is primarily measured in land. These people want access to land, and they're willing to help whoever will offer it. That if Spain is the one that will give them access to land, they're more likely to support Spain. If an independent Mexico, led by the Creoles, is more likely to give them land, then they will support them. So this initial rebellion by Padre Hidalgo will fail. They're not going to succeed in their effort at getting more land, of bringing about land redistribution. However, later, a union of Creoles and mestizos against the Peninsulares will win independence by 1821. So eventually the Creoles and the mestizos work together against the Peninsulares to win independence. However, this could have led to a revolution. Right? We've had a war for independence. It's successful. Mexico becomes independent. This could have led to a revolution, which would transform Mexican society, but it doesn't. Right? Despite the fact that the mestizos support the Creoles, they will stay relatively landless and relatively poor. Right? The mestizos hope that by helping the Creoles, this would lead to land reform, land distribution, so that they would be able to get access to land, but that doesn't happen. And that's why later on, in part, we're going to have a Mexican revolution. So right now, Mexico has had a war for independence. It's become independent of Spain thanks to this alliance of Creoles and Mestizos, but there is no, in a sense, revolution that has transformed society. The Creoles stay on top. The Mestizos are still relatively poor and relatively landless. Between 1810 and 1824, we're going to have these wars for the independence of the Spanish colonies in Central and South America. There's going to be a whole series of wars, right? So pretty much during this time period, every single country in South and Latin America, including Brazil, will become independent. Caribbean countries will not necessarily, but we'll talk more about those later. But what's key is during this time period between 1810 and 1824, so roughly corresponding to the Napoleonic Wars and their aftermath, right? Every single country in pretty much, with maybe a couple exceptions, will become, in South and Central America, will become independent. And the man who leads a lot of these is a man named Simón Bolívar, right? Simón Bolívar. He's got a country named after him, Bolivia. And he is from Venezuela originally, and is very, very popular there. So the person that's going to lead these is a man named Simón Bolívar. His goal was not simply, though, in leading many different countries to independence. He didn't just want these countries to be independent from Spain. He wanted to form a large union of South American countries similar to the United States. So he didn't dream simply of a independent Venezuela. He dreamed of a Venezuela that was also in a union with places like Argentina and Honduras and Costa Rica and so forth. Right, so he dreamed in a sense of a United States of South America, in which case we'd have to change our country's name to the United States of North America, so otherwise it'd be really confusing if we both called ourselves the United States of America. But in any case, that's what he wants to do. He's looking to the United States as kind of a model in that sense of forming a one large country, in a sense, of bound up of these Spanish-speaking colonies. He is successful in bringing independence. He is called in some of these countries is El Librador, the liberator, because he is successful in bringing independence, but he fails to build a large union of South American countries. Basically, the problem is that the people who lead these different, what will become independent countries, places, like I said, like Argentina and Venezuela, Chile, and so forth, the elites are too different in their interests to unify, right? They basically, they see that they think that they will profit more by keeping divided so they can kind of control their own country better served. They see those interests better served than if they had united, right? So, if you're a leader of Argentina, you would say, well, what's in it for me if we unite Argentina with Venezuela and with all these other countries? If you don't see anything in it for you, then you're not going to support that union, right? If you do see it of interest of you, you are going to support that union. And the problem is the elites did not like this. They said that, this isn't going to work. These people in Venezuela, they're different from us people in Argentina. We have different interests. What's good for Venezuela is not necessarily good for Argentina. So we would prefer to stay independent. We would prefer to have our own country. And so this just, unfortunately for Simón Bolívar, doesn't work. And just to be fair, remember, this didn't work for Germany either. Right, there was this effort we talked about in Section 4 to unite the German countries into one single unified country in 1848 through the Frankfurt Assembly, and that failed. Right, that failed to work. It was not successful, and Bismarck had to then unite Germany through force, through violence, through blood and iron. And in the case of Latin America, it's similar. Right, just like those independent German countries, they didn't see, some of them did not see the benefit of union. They said, oh, actually, it's better for us if we stay independent. So they were not willing to do that unless they were forced through war. It's a similar kind of thing here, right? So because the interests of the elites are too different, Simón Bolívar is ultimately not able to unify these countries. What's really fascinating about Simón Bolívar is he tried to hold them together through a liberal dictatorship. And you may say, that's really weird. How do you have a liberal dictatorship? right? Remember, we defined liberalism as having to do with like democracy and voting and people having constitutional rights. And basically his idea was that you would have a liberal democracy, except then Simon Bolivar would be the dictator, so if people got out of line, he would then kind of control them and force them to work together, right? So he wanted to have basically a democratic country where people had political rights that were guaranteed, but then you also had a dictator who could kind of hold things together. That was the idea. And he actually was a fairly liberal dictator at times. Like, he allowed newspapers, for example, to criticize him, which usually dictators don't do. But he is trying to do this kind of weird thing of holding together this attempted Latin American union through a liberal dictatorship, and ultimately that is a contradiction of terms, and it doesn't work. Now, these Latin American revolutions that are led by Simon Bolivar, they are going to have lead to some changes, right? One thing, for instance, that I think is very important is that Simon Bolivar will be convinced that slavery is really wrong. And one thing that convinces him of that fact is that he will actually, while he's leading these wars of liberation, he will actually at one point have to flee to Haiti, and the Haitians, who by this time are independent, will support him and will actually give him weapons and money so he can continue to fight, on the condition that he fights to end slavery. And he doesn't just do this, I think, as a quid pro quo. He doesn't say, okay, you help me, so I'm going to keep my promise of ending slavery. He does do that. He does, help end slavery in some areas of South and Central America. But he actually comes to really believe deeply in that cause, that slavery is really wrong, right? So a lot of Latin American countries will end slavery before, of course, the United States, which doesn't really end slavery until, you could say, 1865. Right, and part of that is because of this Haitian support for these Latin American revolutions led by Simon Bolivar. So there is something revolutionary about these revolutions, right? They do change society in various ways. Now, I have to say, especially in terms of slavery. Now, each Latin American country has its own kind of history of slavery, so we can't just say, well, it just ended all of a sudden in each one. But the key thing was these revolutions did end to the ending of slavery in some areas, and that represents a real change. However, in other ways, things stay the same. Independence usually benefited the Creoles the most, right? The Creoles, remember, resented being told what to do by the Peninsulares. Now they can do what they want because they've gotten rid of the Peninsulares, and so they benefit the most, typically. The uneven division of land remains. Simon Bolivar, even though he was willing to end slavery, was not interested particularly in land reform, in part because he came from a family that owned a lot of land. So the uneven division of land remained. And so what happened then was that there were divisions, massive divisions within society. You had a very few wealthy people, typically Creoles, who owned huge amounts of land. And then you had many poor people who were typically either mestizos, and often below them were people, the indigenous people, and people of African descent. So you had these sharp divisions within society based on economics, based on how much money you had, which was tied to how much land you had, and this was also connected to race. So on top you had white people typically who had the most land and power. Then below them were the mestizos, who were part white and part indigenous people, and they had some land but not very much. And then below them were the people of African descent and the native peoples, who often had very little of anything. So this is kind of a major problem, right? We have independence, but we don't quite, in a sense, have liberty. We've have independence. We've had in a sense, a political revolution, but we haven't had a social or economic revolution. And in this way, many of these are similar in some ways to the United States, though they are more revolutionary in the fact that at least they got rid of slavery in many areas. And so the problem is, when you have a society with this kind of division, you're going to have a lot of frustration, right? A lot of people are not going to like this. Mestizos in particular are frustrated by the fact that they have so little land, so little wealth, and then you have these incredibly wealthy Creoles on the top who monopolize all this land and all this wealth. So the problem is, how do you hold a society like this together? And typically the answer was through dictatorship, right? In a lot of South American countries, you will have the establishment of what are called caudillos. Caudillos are dictatorships which were established to hold society together, typically through force. These were usually controlled by the Creoles, and what happened was the Creoles made sure that they controlled the army and then used the army to hold society together. Right? So these are dictatorships that are used to help hold a society together, which has many people who are frustrated because they lack money, they lack land, and you have this kind of unfair system. So, and of course they do not want participatory democracy, right? They will sometimes have a kind of show democracy, but they do not actually want, the Creoles, the Caudillos, do not want democracy, true democracy, because that would allow the poor to vote. If the poor get to vote, they're going to vote for change. They're going to vote for land reform, which would hurt the Creoles. So the Creoles do not want, in a sense, true democracy that would allow these people to actually have, by people I mean the mestizos, the people of African descent, the native people, doesn't want to actually give them the right to vote, because if they had the right to vote, they would vote for economic change. They would vote for land reform. And so the problem is they have no legitimate, no legal way, in a sense, to show their frustration, to change society. And so that will, if they do want change, that's going to lead to revolt. So there's a couple big problems here. In a lot of South American and Central American countries, they're not going to get the benefits of democracy. Remember, we've talked in the past how democracy helps lead to stability because people can talk about their problems and they can kind of figure out a way to compromise in a way that will prevent civil war, prevent rebellion. Of course, democracies lead people to trust their government more, right? To be nationalistic and patriotic to their government and support their government even when they face very difficult situations. So democracy gives you power, but the Creoles, the Caudillos, don't want democracy, even though it could make the country more powerful because it would hurt their economic interests. And the problem is, if you want significant change, then you need to revolt. You need to have a rebellion if you want significant change. So this encourages instability, right? Encourages instability. And if you're politically unstable, it's that much more difficult to develop economically. Right, so the one of the big problems in South America is, even though they're going to have a lot of wealth, right? They have just as much natural resources and things as people in North America do. But because of how this wealth is divided, and how political power is divided, it's so uneven, it's so concentrated among just a few people, that this will discourage democracy and the power it gives, and it will encourage instability, and it's hard to have good economic development and that sort of thing without stability.